Funding for Poets and Their Craft on Vermont PBS is provided by Phoenix Books, with stores in Burlington, Rutland, and Essex, Vermont. Phoenix Books, supporting our communities in everything we do, from books to authors. Details and information at phoenixbooks.biz. Vermont College of Fine Arts, located in Montpelier, fosters the excellence of established and emerging writers, designers, artists, composers, teachers, and filmmakers through its graduate-level programs. Learn more at vcfa.edu. Northshire Bookstores, fostering discovery and serendipity for babies to the ageless, committed to building community one book at a time, with locations in Manchester, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs, New York, and Middlebury Breadloaf School of English and Breadloaf Writers Conferences attract emerging and established faculty, students, and writers from around the country, a summer tradition for more than 90 years.
Hello, I'm Mary Jane Dickerson. Major Jackson's poetry has always received special attention in the ways it seeks to enlarge and deepen the scope of all American poetry. For this, he has recently received a Guggenheim Fellowship. As a respected poet and as poetry editor of the Harvard Review, he brings all this knowledge and experience to bear on the significance of what I most value in him: the body of his poetry that illuminates our everyday lives. Before joining him for his talk at Bear Pond Books in Montpelier on the music inside lyric poetry, we heard from Claire Benedict, owner of the bookstore.
Personally, I really like to hear a poem read by the poet. That I feel is much more emotional, much more draws you into their meaning and their feeling.
What's gorgeous about lyric poetry is that we are willing to be seduced into the poem because of its music. We're willing to trust what the reader has to say, no matter how eccentric the poem may be. We can detect a certain amount of sound that is pleasing to the ear and to the heart. That's ultimately where we want to go. Another distinguishing feature of lyric poetry, besides song, is that it involves the autobiographical and personal details of often the author's life, but often too an imagined life. In the lyric poem, we seem to be in the presence of a real self and seem to receive autobiographical experience. This fact of the lyric might be easily overlooked because it is so conventional. However, I would like to invite us to consider the authority such a position as the first person I garners and achieves as a mode of witnessing even over 2 millennia. Here's Sappho's fragment 31. He seems to me, that man, almost the God. The man who is face to face with you, sitting close enough to you to hear your sweet whispering and your laughter glistening, which the heart in my breast beats for. For when on you I glance, I do not one sound emit, but my tongue snaps, lightly runs beneath my flesh a flame, and from my eyes no light. And rumbling comes into my ears, and my skin grows damp, and trembling all over racks me, and greener than the grass am I, and one step short of dying, I seem to myself. Here, Sappho sees a desired woman swooning in the arms of a man, which elicits not mere rage, but a physical reaction that pushes her towards sickness and death. She cannot speak, her tongue snaps, she burns inside, my flesh aflame, she says. Her eyes glow dark, from my eyes no light. And this is the most exciting one to me. The scene makes a violent noise in her head. Rumbling comes into my ears. The sight of her beloved drives her steadily senseless. Such an evocative expression of a fit of jealousy is best felt in the first person. I can't imagine it in second or third, but in that subjective I. And this was written slightly over 2.5 millennia. Let's marvel at that for a second. That voice traveling over that distance. Here's a poem that best illustrates this notion of the timeless lyric in an intimate space. It is Robert Duncan's wonderful poem, Often I Am Permitted to Return to a Meadow, which I will caution, when reading, do not irritably reach after meaning, but allow yourself to experience the sway of the poem's language and cadence. This is a lyric poem whose music creates a vortex that calls for your ears rather than your rational mind, although that too will be engaged in fits and starts. Often I am returned to a meadow, as if it were a scene made up by the mind that is not mine, but is a made place that is mine. It is so near to the heart, an eternal pasture folded in all thought, so that there is a hall therein that is a made place, created by light, wherefrom the shadows that our forms fall, wherefrom fall all architectures. I say, are likenesses of the first beloved, whose flowers are flames lit to the lady. She it is, queen under the hill, whose host are disturbance of words within words, that is a field folded. It is only a dream of the grass growing east against the source of the sun in an hour before the sun's going down, whose secret we see in a children's game of ring around of roses told. Often I am permitted to return to a meadow, as if it were a given property of the mind that certain bounds hold against chaos. That is a place of first permission, everlasting omen of what is. What binds us in Duncan's poem, ever so subtly, is not only the music of the poem, but the gorgeous allusions. There's the western wind, with all of its canonized meanings and hints to Western civilization. Grass blowing east against the sun can only be driven by a wind from the west. Then, of course, the queen under the hill, as some Duncan scholars have noted, is an allusion to Persephone, wife of Hades. And finally, the nursery rhyme, Ring Around the Roses, a song that has been attributed to the Middle Ages to indicate the Black Plague. What I admire here is Duncan's ability to tie these allusions in a referential collage of sound, and ever so slightly indicate how they fit into the larger construct of the human intellect, forming the basis or architecture, as it were, of our collective knowledge. The sonic texture of this poem is what allows the faint meanings to glimpse through. After about 2 or 3 lines, the pattern has been set. Poems are built on patterns, like everything around us. And so I'm paying attention to the pattern of line breaks. I'm paying attention to the number of lines per stanza. So it's a combination of intuition as well as a kind of deliberateness about, I should say experimenting. I'm experimenting with the poem and its shape. Sometimes the shape doesn't feel right. Its shape is like a vase or a container, and I'm wanting to get that right. So the typography, how the words are laid out on the page, are hugely important. But in this poem by the great German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, the speed and velocity of the poem, as well as its associative leaps between images and ideas, also inscribe a uniqueness of vision, an announced personality, and an inherent music. More often than not, when it comes to expressing such a feeling as love and longing, one is bound to fail. But Rilke makes a sound through a combination of images and emotive utterances whose excess, although more fitting for 19th century, still resonates today. You who never arrived in my arms, beloved, who were lost from the start, I don't even know what songs would please you. I have given up trying to recognize you in the surging wave of the next moment. All the immense images in me, the far-off, deeply felt landscape, cities, towers, and bridges, and unsuspected turns in the path, and those powerful lands that were once pulsing with the life of the gods, all rise within me to mean you, who forever elude me. You, beloved, who are all the gardens I ever gazed at, longing, an open window in a country house, and you almost stepped out pensive to greet me. Streets that I chanced upon, you had just walked down them and vanished, and sometimes in a shop, the mirrors were still dizzy with your presence, and startled gave back my too sudden image. Who knows? Perhaps the same bird echoed through both of us yesterday, separate, in the evening. Every poem births itself through a many different set of variables, and often I am kind of inspired into writing a poem based on what I've observed that particular day and the kind of machinations an experience will take my mind through. A certain rhythm and pacing of a sound, a certain rhythm and pacing of a sound, a certain rhythm and pacing of a sound of words together will often have me kind of follow through, well, where's that sound going? So sometimes the words are incidental to the beat that's inside of me that wants to find its way into the world through language. So language is my drum in a lot of ways. I have not disappeared. The boulevard is full of my steps. The sky is full of my thinking. An archbishop prays for my soul, even though we met only once. And even then, he was busy waving at a congregation. The ticking clocks in Vermont sway back and forth, as though sweeping up my eyes and my tattoos and my metaphors. And what comes up are the great paragraphs of dust, which also carry motes of my existence. I have not disappeared. My wife quivers inside a kiss. My pulse was given to her many times in many countries. The chunks of bread we dip in olive oil is communion with our ancestors who also have not disappeared. Their delicate songs I wear on my eyelids. Their smiles have given me freedom, which is a crater I keep falling in. When I bite into the two halves of an orange whose cross-section resembles my lungs, a delta of juices bursts down my chin, and like magic, makes me appear to those who think I've disappeared. It's too bad war makes people disappear like chess pieces, and that prisons turn prisoners into movie endings. When I fade into the mountains on a forest trail, I still have not disappeared, even though its green facade turns my arms and legs into branches of oak. It is then I belong to a southerly wind, which by now you have mistaken as me nodding back and forth like a Hasid in prayer, or a mother who has just lost her son to gunfire in Detroit. I have not disappeared. In my children, I see my bulging face pressing further into the mysteries. In a library in Tucson, on a plain above Buenos Aires, on a field where nearby burns a controlled fire, I'm held by a professor, a general, and a photographer. One burns a finely wrapped cigar, then sniffs the scented pages of my book, scouring for the bitter smell of control. I hold him in my mind like a chalice. I have not disappeared. I swish the amber hue of lager on my tongue and ponder the drilling rigs in the Gulf of Alaska and all the oil-painted plovers. When we talk about limits, we disappear. In Jasper, Texas, you can disappear on a strip of gravel. I am a life in sacred language. Termites toil over a grave, and my mind is a ravine of yesterdays. At a glance from across the room, I wear September on my face, which is eternal and does not disappear, even if you close your eyes once and for all, simultaneously, like two coffins. In composing the poem, I knew I wanted to use disappear as an anchor, a musical phrase, the rhythm section to the poem's exploration of how the past, said prosaically, is always a fathomable component of the present, an indelible aspect of modernity, and yet, moreover, how art and literature survive as an artifact and records our lives. The lines emerged out of the poem's accumulation of analogs and my search for figures or images that illustrated where in our lives we replicate ourselves and are entered by the world around us, both the natural and unseen worlds. As the poem built its musical structure, the repetition also began to load and collect images that felt submerged yet gathered and multiplied from line to line in an almost riotous yet organic flowering, what Robert Bly terms in his useful book, Leaping Poetry, an ecstatic widening of associations. No part of this poem was rearranged, so the images truly are built upon each other. The initial image was the image of the clock. And I grew up in a house that had a grandfather clock. I loved that clock. I used to gaze at it all the time and just let myself get lost daydreaming because it was right by the windows. I would be there. And I couldn't wait for the gong. I'm talking very early years, like 6, 7, and 8. But that sweeping motion or that back and forth reminded me of a broom. And so now the clock has generated another image, which is a domestic tool that's almost, it's a symbol in our lives, the broom. And so that triggered, well, what is it sweeping up? I could have been very literal and said dust, but dust comes later. I wanted to remark on something that has to do with seeing and the role of seeing in the construction of a poem. Each image I tried to create some sort of association, and when I exhausted that search, then I would repeat the phrase, I have not disappeared, so I can jumpstart the process again. That's the message of the poem, is that we live in the ether, we live in the air, we live in the memories of our beloveds and our children, and in our art. Ultimately, that's where I want to land on. Poet Brenda Shaughnessy is well aware, maybe excessively so, of poetry's aspiration toward verbal lyricism, and I'm sure has read Keats's famous axiom from his letter to John Taylor, dated February 27, 1818. Quote, poetry should surprise by a fine excess and not by singularity. The excess in Brenda Shaughnessy's Your One Good Dress is that of her unique brand of humor and whimsicalness. Your one good dress should never be light. That kind of thing feels like 100 shiny-headed waifs, backlit and skeletal, approaching, dripping, and in unison, murmuring, we are you. No, and the red dress, think about it, redress, is all neck hole. The brown is a big wet beard with, of course, a backslit. You're only as sick as your secrets. There is an argument for the dull chic, the dirty olive, and the Cinderella, But those who exhort it are only part of the conspiracy. Shimmer schmimmer, they'll say. Lush schmush. Do not listen. It's part of the anti-obvious movement, and it's sheer matricide. Ask your mum. It would kill her if you were UGLY. And is it a crime to wonder, am I? In the dark, a dare. Am I now? You put on your Nina, your Pinta, your Santa Maria. Make it simple to last your whole life long. Make it black, glassy, or deep. Your body is opium, and you are its only true smoker. This black dress is your one good dress. Bury your children in it. Visit your pokey hometown friends in it. Go missing for days. Taking it off never matters. That just wears you down. Shaughnessy is a poet of immense and epic whimsicalness. On the surface of Your One Good Dress is a celebration of sonic gestures and lighthearted humor framed within tight quatrains. But beneath the echoes is a serious, nearly urgent exhortation to settle into oneself and against and within the age of beauty products and clothing that aggressively advertise to make women feel better about themselves, to navigate away from harmful rhetoric that wears you down. Shaughnessy surprises across the total score of the poem, as Keats would have read this poem, and renders a textured, sonically rich surface that not only astonishes but also allows her psyche to land upon two of her most memorable utterances in my history of reading her. The poem builds through a series of sonic devices, distant rhymes and reverbs, backlit, backslit, puns, red dress, redress, and ugly spelled UGLY. Repetition, am I now? Alliteration is part of the anti-obvious movement and its sheer matricide, ask your mum. The poem creates a center of passionate engagement with language such that what is allowed to sneak through are metaphorical propositions with such deep resonances and meanings it would take another whole essay to carry out their implications. You're as sick as your secrets. Your body is opium. And you are its only true smoker. The lyric poem, in closing, in making its own unique sound, ritualizes remembrance and thought as it attempts to seduce readers into reliving experiences that are sung full-throated into a unique song. The truth of the matter is that very few of us feel as deeply or think as intensely as Sappho, Shaughnessy, Rilke, Neruda, Billie Holiday, Dexter Gordon. And thus, as writers of poetry, we must work to create surfaces of poems that announce originality, that create sounds within sounds, trading eights, trading fours. Although I have denoted some of the strategies by which poets make music in their work, I have not exhausted or even begun to scratch the surface of music or lyricism in poetry. The trope of poets singing their lives is as old as poetry itself. From Sappho to Bob Dylan, and from Archeolocos to Jay-Z, poets have given expression to lost loves, erotic yearnings, the birth of a daughter, the guilt of eating someone else's fruit in the refrigerator, death of a dear friend, unexplained jealousy of a younger sibling, and just about every other aspect of the human journey that we all share. As best summed up, again, by Whitman, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Thank you. Yes.
You've mentioned many poets this evening. I think earlier on you said something about coming to poets when you were forming yourself, so to speak, growing up. Could you say more about what poets first got your attention and why and when?
Well, I regret that it's the same answer every time, and that's my grandparents had not a formal library, but they had books in the house. And the two poets that I discovered were Langston Hughes and Robert Frost. And later I would study with poet Sonia Sanchez, who was among those poets in the late 1960s who kind of captured the spirit of freedom and liberation, which is a concept that I want to kind of work into this notion of one's individual music. Because I think the lyric self truly that makes the note expresses a certain kind of freedom, one that's not, even though, you know, even a song like Body and Soul, sung by Billie Holiday, has the same lyrics over and over again. When she sings it, you can almost feel, in how she renders that song, a certain amount of freedom. And so those particular poets, for various reasons, Langston Hughes's commitment to a kind of vernacular speech and black folk culture was important to me. Frost, because of his ear. And although I grew up in Philadelphia, I spent summers in Nashville, Tennessee. And so my kind of connection to the natural world and the culture, the people who actually worked the land, was something that I inherited that allowed me to appreciate the kind of wizened, and there's a certain kind of wizened personality in my family as well, that those poems by Frost kind of echoes that I appreciate as well. But that there have been many other poets after those three, and I always mention them in interviews. I really feel like I owe them a great debt because, like I say in this paper, I think poets, encountering other poets, kind of spark us into our own songs, our own attempts at writing poems. The poetry occasioned us to be courageous in what's inside of us, saying what we truly feel, or giving voice to something we didn't know was inside of us. So I'm gonna stick with that. Humans need it.